Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my reaction of Red Effect's problems with the M1 Abrams. Now, I will say a lot of the things he says make sense, but I can definitely tell he is no tanker, and most of the things he talks about makes no sense to him. And I also have the book King of the Killing Zone, written by Orr Kelly, and I believe it was published in 1988 or 89 or 90, somewhere around there, late 80s. But a lot of the things that the book talks about he talks about as well, such as the filtration system on the engine, the armor, the thermal sights, and there's a couple of things, and there's a few things he says about the tank commander that are erroneously wrong. So here we go.
And some that still persist in the latest variants. First one is of course the original M1. The tank officially entered service in 1981, and at the time it wasn't really good.
False. That is entirely false. The reason why that is wrong is the M1 is a significant upgrade from the M60, even the M60A3 TTS. One, you have significantly better armor on the M1. That's number one. Number two, the ammo is in a separate compartment. You have semi-ready, ready rack, and you have the whole ammo. So if you do get hit in the ammo, the tank doesn't blow up. That's number two. Number three, the stabilized or the gun stabilization in the M1 was significantly better than the M60A3. You can go see it in Gunner Heat PC, assuming they modeled it correctly. I'm going to go on a limb and say that they did. And the main reason why is on the M1, they stabilized the sights rather than a gun. That's the problem with the M60, is it was at a dead-end technology by the mid 80s, or not mid 80s, mid 70s, and there's only so many things they could do to make it better. And at that point, their choice was to either build more M60s or M60A3 TTSs or buy M1s. And since the United States Army at that point was only going to be so big, you're better off buying a better tank.
It still had the old 105mm gun, which was already...
Yes, it was obsolete by that point in time. Actually, correction, I would say obsolescent. Obsolete means it can still do the job, it's just not as good as others.
starting to get obsolete. The performance of the gun was rather poor compared to Soviet 125 or German 120mm guns.
Alright, before we get to the engine, so in the book King of the Killing Zone, page 171, the chapter is the $5 billion half inch. Now this goes from 1977 up until the early 80s. And the problem with it is the Army, they wanted the 120 gun. However, they realized they had to get the tank bought. So they bought the tank with the 105 so that way later on they could come back and install the 120 gun, which is why the M1E1 exists. The M1E1 is the original M1 with its shorter turret where they stuck a 120 in it and they changed out the ammo racks and I believe the ready rack, the semi-ready, and the whole ammo. However, putting the 120 gun, which is a hell of a lot bigger with a hell of a lot bigger rounds in a smaller turret, it hurts you being able to load it. Okay, on to the engine.
Another problem is the engine. At the time, Germans have already developed a 1500 horsepower diesel engine. But because
no, it's not because of reasons. Also in the book King of the Killing Zone, on page... no, not 109. We have Turbine in the Dust, page 143. There were 3 engines proposed for the M1 tank. One was the German Daimler-Benz diesel, and the other diesel was a Teledyne Continental Motors. That was the diesel. And then the third engine was the Avco Lycoming AGT 1500. The problem with the German engine One, it's liquid cooled. The Army, based on their experiences in World War II, they did not like that, and they wanted to continue to have an engine that was either air cooled, which is they would just prefer air cooled because that way there's less stuff going on inside the engine. Okay, so the other thing with the Teledyne diesel, it was variable compression. At that point in time, variable compression engines were not very reliable. They finally got the design ironed out, and they protested the Chrysler engine, or the Avco Lycoming 1500 turbine. They protested it, but it was too late. The turbine had already been entrenched. So, and then the other problem with the German diesel is that it comes down to politics. In the book, on page 144, on the second paragraph down, I'm going to read it for you. Finally, it was politics more than technology that ruled out the German engine. Choice of the Teledyne engine would mean 1,500 to 2,000 jobs in Michigan. The Pentagon was unlikely to risk the political flack of moving these jobs to West Germany. The alternative to the diesel was a helicopter engine adapted for use in a tank by Avco Lycoming. Although it would be built in Connecticut rather than Michigan, at least it would provide jobs in the United States, not Europe. Congressmen from both states lobbied for their engine, but their efforts had no apparent influence on the final decision. That is in the book King of the Killing Zone. Okay, let's go on to what next he has to say.
US decided to go with a far more expensive gas turbine AGT 1500. Not only was it far more expensive than the German diesel, it also consumed a lot more fuel.
So in the early iterations, he is correct. Later on, I believe it was when the DECU came out, the Digital Electronics Control Unit. I believe that came out for the SEP. But I know it's in the SEP too, the SA, and the FEP.
Which means that operating it was also more expensive. On top of that, the engine had rather poor
I'm going to let him finish this point.
filtration system, but more on that later. Don't get me wrong, the mobility was excellent, but there is nothing that would justify the use of the gas turbine.
Nah, we're past that.
The tank was rather lacking. Unlike the Soviet tanks of the period, he could not.
So he's talking about the tank commander here, and he's wrong again. So the handle that's in the tank commander's right hand, that you can see in this picture, that is a tank commander's override. It provides all the same controls that the gunner's Cadillacs, as you can see that the gunner has in his hands. The only difference is instead of the palm switch being with your ring finger, your middle finger, and your pinky finger, the palm switch is done with actually your hand. So when you grasp it, your hand is what crushes in the palm switch, engages the hydraulics on the turret. The button right here, that is your laser rangefinder, and hidden behind his, that's for something else, but hidden behind here where his right finger is, that's where the trigger is. So that is the tank commander's override. I don't know why this guy, clearly he's not a tanker or a tank mechanic that's ever worked on an actual tank or actually asked questions about the Abrams.
Not override the turret. On top of that, he didn't even have a specific.
Okay, that is true on the original M1s. However, not necessarily important because it comes down to doctrine. The Soviet doctrine was to stay buttoned up. The American doctrine is not to stay buttoned up so that you can actually see the battlefield. In Gunner Heat PC, the tank commander has passive night vision. I think it was PVS 7s at that time. Now they got PVS 14s. I think they're Gen 2s or maybe Gen 3s depending upon the unit. But the tank commander has passive IR. And you can see I've only looked through the PVS 14s, and those are good out to, depending upon the moonlight conditions, anywhere from 500 to 1,500 meters if you know what you're looking for. If you don't know what you're looking for, probably like 300. But generally you'd use them close in, not really to spot targets, more of to direct the driver where you want him to go, because he can only see so much. All right, let's go on to his next point.
Sight for him. Only had access to all-around periscopes, like on a Sherman. and a sight for a remote machine gun, which was not even stabilized.
So again, he misses the point of why the 50 caliber is there. The 50 caliber is only there when the tank commander has no other option to engage. A tank commander's job is not to shoot. His job is to direct the tank to where it needs to be, find targets for the gunner so he can kill targets, and talk on a radio and navigation for the platoon and do platoon tasks. His job is not to pull triggers. He's not supposed to shoot. Yes, there's engagement in gunnery from the tank commander's position, but that's it. Everything else is supposed to be done by other crew members. That's why they're called the gunner or the driver.
Like the Soviet one, and had a rather poor magnification.
Okay, on to the next point.
Even the German Leopard 2, which the US tested prior to adopting the M1, had a commander's independent, fully stabilized sight, which the commander could use to override the turret.
Yes, the Leopard 2 originally had the CITV. The Army originally wanted the Hunter Killer system, which is what it's called in the British lexicon. The problem is, again, they had to get the tank first, and then they could upgrade it later, which is why the M1 has been upgraded so much. Kind of proof to the original design that the guys that originally designed the tank is still out there today. To me, that's more of a proof of concept than anything else.
The only thing the M1 commander could do when he notices a target through his vision blocks, that were just that, they had no magnification or anything, he could take a look through the gunner primary sight extension.
Non-tankers and tank mechanics. Or FSRs or whatever. Okay.
If you think that is problematic, wait till you hear this. The commander in M1 was completely blind during...
As I discussed earlier, it is not. He had a passive IR night vision device that he would hold in his hands or connect to his CBC or helmet, whichever he wanted or whichever he preferred, to be able to see at night.
the night. Because he had no sight of his own, he could not look for targets during the night, and could only look through the gun sight extension in the thermal mode.
That's Gen 1 thermals, I think. Yeah, it's Gen 1.
In comparison, Soviet commander's sight had access to passive and
Okay, so as many people can see in Gunner Heat PC, that the passive IR and active IR sights that the Warsaw Pact had are garbage. Absolute garbage. 1,000 meters is their effective range, maybe 1,500 if you're lucky, but more likely 1,000 is your max effective range at night. And considering the M60A3 TTS and the original M1 have Gen 1 thermals, that means they can see you at 3,500 meters. And if they can see you, they can hit you. I don't know why this guy misses that part.
active night vision sight, where he could search for targets even in the night. When the tank entered service, soon there were already plans to increase the protection, because the Russian 125mm APF SDS of the time could have been able to penetrate its armor. That is when IPM-1 comes up, and the only difference between IPM-1 and M1 is the improved protection on the turret. That is it.
It's more than that because it gets into small little details here and there because there is some, I want to say, crew creature comforts that were improved, but pretty much is just the turret armor.
It retained the same problems as the M1. M1A1 then came along and fixed the issue of firepower by introducing the 120mm gun. The firepower was improved, but Soviets at the time developed new monoblock projectiles that could have affected even the improved armor. So there were plans to put the depleted uranium in the armor.
So the one thing I also missed out is the original M1A1, it had an actual pressurized NBC system that would take air off of the engine, put it through a whole bunch of coolers, so that way it would come out into the tank and put positive pressure into the tank. It would only be like 1, 2, or 3 psi, not very much. That's why any contaminants would not make their way inside of the tank. Air would always be pushing out, whether it's through the gun tube, the coax, or the hatches, because the hatches never seal correctly, as people who have ever been on tanks understand perfectly. It's a brand new seal, but it's still leaking rainwater.
And so, in 1989, M1A1HA came out with depleted uranium being put in the turret armor composition.
Yes, that is correct. However, most of the tanks for Desert Storm did not have it. There is very few that had additional weld-on armor on the front of the turret, which this video doesn't have it, and I'm not going to sit here and waste your guys'
Which
time.
improved the protection. But the problem is that the hull received no upgrades whatsoever. It was still the same as on the
Yes, the hull armor did not change until the SEP 3. And the reason why I know this, I was part of the team that rebuilt the M1A1 essays for Ukraine. And the only place in the U.S. that is authorized to change the armor package on a tank is Lima, Ohio. And so the armor package on the SA, which had, I believe, second generation depleted uranium turret armor, that was replaced with a export package armor. I don't know what it is. No one really knows what it is until Russia cuts one apart and tells you
original
what it
M1.
is.
Even if the hull was upgraded, the issue still persists. The problem with the hull armor design is that the upper front plate is only 38.
Okay, so yes, the frontal armor is fairly, or the front glacis is fairly thin, or the front slope, as tankers will call it a lot. Despite that, and the glorious weak spot underneath the gun and the turret ring itself, the reason why that is that way is so when the gun is over the front, even at max depression, the driver is supposed to be able to get out of the tank. That's why the front of the turret is shaped that way. If they didn't care about the driver getting out and surviving, then they wouldn't have done that. Also in the King of the Killing Zone, to understand their thought process on it, page 108. The characteristics were listed in this order of importance for the M1 when it was first being designed. Number one is crew survivability, because you can always replace another tank. You can replace a tank, that's easy. Replacing a very good crew, that is exceptionally hard. Number two, surveillance and target acquisition performance. Number three, first and subsequent round hit probability. 4, time to acquire and hit. 5, cross-country mobility. 6, complementary armament integration. 7, equipment survivability. 8, environmental impact. I don't know why that's number 8. Number 9, so how big the vehicle is, how tall it is, because the M1 is a lot shorter than the M60. Number 10, acceleration and deceleration. 11, ammunition stowage. 12, human factors, as we would call today, ergonomics. 13, producibility. 14, range. 15, speed. 16, diagnostic aids. That helps you to fix the tank to keep it in the fight. 17th, or number 17, growth potential, which we're on the SEP V3, so the M1's done pretty good. Number 18, support equipment, and 19, transportability. Later in the video, he goes on to the L55. And I can't find the symposium that there is, but I will explain that when we get to it.
Millimeters thick. And even though it is sloped, EPFSDS projectiles, especially monoblock ones, will have no trouble going through it. Even if they do bounce off by some miracle, they are launched directly into the turret ring and would penetrate it with no issues. No matter what happens, a hit there would end up penetrating the tank. Also, keep in mind that even though firepower and protection were improved, M1A1HA had no other issues fixed. The commander was still blind in the night and could not override the turret. And the engine still consumed a lot of fuel and had poor filtration system. This was especially a problem during Gulf War when the filters had
talking with people that actually been in Desert Storm, it was not as bad as he proclaims. So also in the book King of the Killing Zone, which page is it? Okay, so the Army would have known about this long before Desert Storm, and they did. So in, what year is this? 1979, when 3rd ACR, I believe it was 3rd ACR, at Fort Bliss, Texas, was testing the first pre-production prototypes of the M1. And what they came across is, so on page 164, and about two-thirds down the page, starting the paragraph, from the beginning, everyone had been concerned about dust getting into the turbine. A turbine is less susceptible to damage from grit than a diesel because it has fewer moving parts and more room between parts. But the volume of air flowing through a turbine is so great that even a small leak in a filter can permit enough dust to enter the engine and cause harm. When engines at Bliss began to break down because of dust ingestion, the problem was particularly troubling because an early prototype of the turbine engine tank had operated successfully in a sandy desert near Yuma, Arizona. With the help of the stylist Skirt Blake, Blakesley had insisted on, the tank had seemed to be immune to damage from dust. Lett and Felder reluctantly faced up to the fact that they couldn't find a way to keep the tracks on and prevent the engine from grinding itself to death. The Army did not have a new tank. It had a sitting duck. They were wrung a grudging okay from the Blakesley and asked the Army to suspend the test for 30 days. The engine problem required a real feat of detection. This is what had happened. In the middle of one night, when the workers were trying to lower the engine and transmission, known as a power pack, into the first test model, they couldn't make it fit. They woke an engineer at home and asked him to hurry down. He told the workers to trim a little metal off the engine air inlet. The same fix was made on all 11 pilot vehicles, but the change seemed so minor as not reported to Chrysler executives. When the workers sealed the air filter to the engine air inlet, enough metal had been removed from the inlet to leave a tiny gap. Because of that gap, they found the problem. So, they found this problem on the original M1s back in 1979. So the Army knew about it. It was not every few hours. Most likely, when it happened, is when they had a maintenance halt. And you're going to have maintenance halt once a day. But for most of the tankers I have talked to that were in Desert Storm, they told me it was a 4-day movement to contact, which means you are on the go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You do not stop until you find and kill the enemy. So this problem was a problem, and the Army knew about it, but they hadn't figured out a way to fix it. Well, correction. At this time, it'd be General Dynamics Land Systems hadn't figured out a way to fix it yet, which is solved with the original M1A2. When the M1A2 first came out, it had a pulse jet system, which is why the Heavy Common is out. The Heavy Common came out in 93, 94, around the same time as the original A2. Yes, I know people say that the A2 came out in 1986. While, yes, it did come out, it was not in production, and it was not actually issued to units until the 90s. Even then, most of the tanks that the U.S. military had in the 90s was M1A1s. Heavy armors and heavy commons.
To be cleaned every couple of hours. The reason for that is that the gas turbine sucked in a lot of air, and simple filters, like the ones of Abrams at the time, weren't enough. The Swedes and the Soviets, who had adopted gas turbine engines before,
We're gonna skip ahead to the A2 because I've already gone over the
it fixed
filtration
a lot of
stuff
issues.
and
First
how
and foremost,
wrong
the
red
commander
effect
was no
is.
longer blind during the night, and now got his own sight with thermal imager that he could use to override the turret.
Okay, where he is right and wrong. Number one, if a tank commander is using a CITV to guide the tank through terrain, that's got to be some really bad environmental factors. Blinding rain, blinding sand, snowstorm, dust storm. But even in such bad storms, you're not really going to move. Because if you can't see, you can't move. And if you can't see anyone, you're in a 70-ton tank that's going to crush somebody and you're not going to know about it. And with the CITV, it added what will be described on the M1A1 is called slew to queue, where the tank commander is scanning with the CITV, he finds a target, he hits the button, he says designate the fire command, and the gunner or the GPS comes all the way over and lines up with his CITV. At that point, the commander has to dump his Cadillacs for the gunner to grab his, or the gunner will already grab his, so the gunner has control of the turret.
The filtration system was also fixed since pulse jet filters were installed.
Heavy common, not heavy armor. Because heavy common's 1992, 93. So, the pulse jet system, that helps to alleviate problems with clogged air filters. However, it is not a complete fix. In the manual, it tells you when you have a air filter clogged warning pop inside the driver's compartment, that is when you pull the VPACs and you blow them out. Bang them out, blow them out, whatever you have to do to get the tank back running. And the pulse jet system does break on occasion, but it's most likely due to the line that comes off the engine. It fails time to time. It's not. It goes through heat cycles and it breaks just like everything else does on a tank. Okay, that is the high profile crows, which not come out until 2012, I want to say. And even in the high profile crows, not a single tanker I have met like this thing. This thing is a giant turd. It blocks your forward vision. It's like an additional 3 feet above. It's like this giant box that's 3 feet wide, so almost a meter wide and almost a meter tall, that is right in front of the tank commander. So he can't do his job if he can't see. The high profile crows, great concept. A giant hunk of junk. There's a reason why no American tanks have it anymore. Or at least they shouldn't. You probably haven't gone through all the upgrades yet on some of the SEP2s that still might have the
Stabilized
high
remote
profile
machine gun was
crows.
replaced with a stabilized weapon station on M1A2 or received the stabilization on M1A1 tanks. But the upper front plate problem was never fixed. According to Michael Green, M1A2 had 51mm thick upper front plate, but that is still not nearly enough.
Okay, so he is right, but however, Americans are trained to fight hull down as much as possible. So in my, was it hull down, turret down, berm drills video that I did for Gunner Heat PC, the problem that he's describing is as much of a problem because if you always train to do that, you're not gonna have an issue. And I don't care what anyone says, a turret ring on a tank is always the weakest spot, and you can't do anything about it. Anything you try and do to make it cover the turret ring means it makes it that much easier to jam the turret. So there's really not that. It's a fine line between. Everything's a compromise on a tank. You can't have a perfectly protected tank. That's impossible.
Not to mention that modern projectiles can go through it like hot knife through butter. The engine's fuel consumption is still much higher than any diesel engine. I know you probably think APU fixed the issue.
Okay, so he's mixing up two things. So I'm going to talk about the turbine engine and why I think a turbine engine is better than a diesel. Let's take two engines. Both make 1500 horsepower gross. That means no accessories, no nothing, just the engine by itself. You add on the cooling system, you're going to lose, even if it's just 100 horsepower, just the cooling system for the engine. That's 100 horsepower lost right off the bat, and you can't do anything about it. That's not including any of the other accessories, such as the generator or alternators, people would know it on cars, a hydraulic pump, or the fuel pump for the engine, whatever it may be. Anything that is driven off of that engine drags away horsepower. Yes, the M1 has two cooling fans and one scavenger fan. The two cooling fans, as far as I know, they don't pull that much horsepower off the engine because they're driven off of the transmission, and you really don't notice it. The turbine is cooled by air, and the oil is cooled for it as well. So that's what makes the turbine so efficient, is that it's very space efficient. Yes, it uses up a lot of air to do it, but it does work. Back in the early 2000s, there was a program called the GELV, General Electric LV 100-5. And this engine proposed to be about 20% more fuel efficient at idle and about 30% or so more efficient while running. You guys can look up General Electric LV 100-5. It does exist. There's a date on it, like 2002. It provides the same horsepower and its drop-in capability for the tank. And they never bought it because of the war on terror.
But no, it did not. APU is there for the engine not to be used when the tank is idle, because gas turbine consumes as much fuel on idle as it does on the move. When the tank is moving,
He's somewhat correct. But the APU thing, that is meant for you to keep the batteries charged so that way you can run extended ops without having to run the engine. Now, in a cold environment, I would still run the engine just because it's not that it's hard to start, because I've had turbine engines start in, I think, zero, or what is it, 0 degrees Fahrenheit, or I think that's like negative 25 degrees Celsius, somewhere around there. Excuse me. And the engine will start. It's just every few hours I'd start it back up. So that way it keeps the heat in the engine. So when you go to move, you're not trying to warm up all the oils inside the engine and the transmission.
It
Because
still
that eats up
wastes a lot of
horsepower too.
fuel. Another argument for the gas turbine is that it's multi-fuel. Well, all diesel engines of modern tanks are multi-fuel. Yeah, they can't use the same amount of different fuels the gas
No. You can look up the Chieftain's multi-fuel engine disaster. So a turbine engine, you can throw gasoline in it, you can throw diesel, you can throw JP8 in it, you can throw kerosene, anything that burns. I think there's a not a running joke. It was a proof of concept back in the 50s with the Chrysler turbine car. They managed to run the car on perfume. So a turbine engine is far more, I wouldn't say fuel efficient. You can feed it whatever you want and it'll eat it. Yes, you're going to lose horsepower compared to, it really likes JP8. Diesel's pretty close to JP8. And gasoline, I think you lose like 10% horsepower, somewhere around there. Now, the diesel's being multi-fuel kind of thing. So on the M88A2, just going from JP8 to diesel, you have to retime the engine or retime the fuel injectors when they fire so that they put the fuel out when the engine really likes it. Because if you just constantly swap between the two, the engine doesn't like it, and you have to retime the engine so it'll work. Which is why for the U.S. military, they swapped everything over to JP8. Everything runs on JP8. So that way you're only buying one fuel. It makes it pretty easy.
turbine can. But the question is, what's the point? The army will have diesel or gasoline or whatever fuel they use the most. The multi-fuel argument kinda becomes invalid when you realize that the army would take one type of fuel for the vehicles, because majority of ground vehicles do not use gas turbine engines. No one in their right mind would take specific fuel with them just so they could have it if they run out of diesel, just so they could use it on Abrams. No other vehicle, just Abrams, because Abrams is the
Nah. Oh my god. Someone who's never been in the military talking about tanks. Annoying.
only one with that ability. The problems of
On a more positive note, this is an M1A1 FEP. And the reason why you can tell that is the smoke grenade dischargers over here on the left and the SCWS that the tank commander has. And it does not have any of the armor that would be here for the M1A1 SA.
M1A1 Commander were somewhat fixed by the introduction of Stabilized Commander's Weapon Station on M1A1 SA variant, which is the latest one in use. It gave a thermal sight to the commander and the ability to override the turret with a slew to Q option, thus making it perform similar role of CITV.
No, that is only the M1A1 FEP. The Stabilized Commander's Weapon Station for the SA does not have that capability.
But I don't know how good the actual thermal sight is on Stabilized Weapon Station, since the sight appears to be relatively small. Thus, I doubt its performance is as good as M1A2's CITV.
It's surprisingly good. You can spot targets out to, depending upon the conditions, close to 2,000 meters. Depending upon conditions, that's the main thing. No, it is not as good as CITV, but for the point of putting the gunner on target, it's close enough. That's all you're trying to do as a tank commander is find targets, which they both do just fine.
But now another problem has appeared. Since Abrams has a ammunition compartment of a limited length, it is starting to meet the same fate as Russian tanks. And that is the fact that APF-SES ammunition
I don't know why people don't just say Sabo.
has already reached the peak length, even with MA29A3, since the new MA29A4 is of the comparable length. One way to fix this problem would be to introduce the L55 gun that the Germans are
Okay, so the L55 gun. There is a symposium out there. You guys can look it up. The M250-61. They did it, I believe, in 2001 or 2000? Late 90s, early 2000s. So that way I'm not speaking out of turn. The reason why you cannot put an L55 in an M1 is effect you lose your stabilization. The recoil system is set up for the L54, the L44. The stabilized The vertical stabilization is set up for the L44. Because of that, you can't just yes, a L55 will physically fit inside of an M1. It will not work though. In talking with the Rheinmetall engineers, when I had a chance to, the differences when on the Leopards, when they went from the L44 to the L55, they changed their entire turret traverse and gun elevation and depression from hydraulic to electric. They also changed out what they called as a hydraulic brake for the gun. That's the only way they could describe it to me, because going from German to English is bizarre. But that's really it. But they had to go to electric motors for their elevation and traverse for the turret, and they had to go to a stronger gun brake, hydraulic brake.
Using on their Leopard 2A6 and 2A7 tanks, or the new L55A1 with improved performance. Therefore, there is no need to solve the projectile length issue since the better gun.
And the other reason why we did not go to the L55 is with the performance that we get out of M829 Alpha 3 is the same, I think, as DM63 out of the L55. And the reason why is the DU penetrator. And plus, we load that ammunition really hot. Like most of the 120 millimeter main gun rounds have an estimated or equivalent full charge of 1, while M829 Alpha 3 has an equivalent full charge of 10. So it's worth one M829 or 3 is like shooting 10 normal main gun rounds. It is really hard on the tank and the gun tube. However, you get the same performance. And the other thing that a lot of people miss over the M1 versus the Leopard is the M1 goes all over the world, significantly more than the Leopard does. There's many times where I have gone from Fort Bliss, Texas, where I was stationed at. I've gone to Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. I came to Poland back in, was it 2018, 2019, somewhere around there. And then I went back to the Middle East again. And we took our tanks with us every single time. So the tanks went from Fort Bliss, Texas, got trained to somewhere else in the U.S., then got on a boat, and the boat went from wherever the hell it was in the U.S. to wherever we were going. The U.S. ships their tanks, or the units, go with their vehicles all the time. That, adding a gun tube that's an additional meter longer, means that that tank takes up more space now, which means more space. You either need bigger ships or you're going to fit less stuff.
Would increase the performance of already existing projectiles. For example, the M63 fired by Leopard 2 tanks is shorter than the M829A3 fired by Abrams, but according to available information, has a relatively comparable performance because it is fired from a longer gun. To sum it all up, when first appeared, M1 had unsatisfactory.
I'm not going to let him finish because it doesn't matter. Okay, if people that are not tankers or tank mechanics are going to make opinions on tank or opinion piece, which is what this is, on the Abrams, you really have got to know your shit. That's the problem I'm having with this. If you are someone that speaks about on paper, the T-72 is just as good as an M1. It may be on paper, but in reality, it doesn't even hold a candle. Thanks for watching my rants with this guy with Red Effect over the problems with the Abrams tank.